in African anthropology at the Field Museum of Natural History and a lecturer at UIC. Foreman was born and raised in Zimbabwe. He received his PhD in archaeology at the University of Cape Town, which is the oldest university in South Africa. Dr. Bandama is one of the authors of a book, The Riddle of Intelligence, It's Not What You Think, as well as multiple academic papers. As an archaeologist, he studies African pre-industrial civilizations. He specializes in ceramics, glass beads, archaeometallurgy, and his heritage studies. His work blends conventional material cultural studies and archaeometallurgical analysis to explore the history, innovations, and technologies of African societies in Southwest Africa. So please join me in a warm Mawiya. Welcome to Foreman.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I definitely like this group already. You do a lot of cool and exciting things. Rocking with the computer tomorrow. Really? I wish I was there. Thank you so much. Allow me to get straight to tonight's talk. I hope you will not miss any word because of my accent. As you heard, I was born in Zimbabwe, Southeast Zimbabwe. Those of you who are familiar with the Kruger National Park in South Africa, I'm on the other side. And the Kruger elephants do come and mess with my crops once in a while. But today I'm going to be talking about one of the bigger civilizations south of the pyramids, which is Great Zimbabwe, which is the archaeological site that gave the name Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is named after this archaeological site. Well, sometimes we stay awake at night, but because of different reasons. For me, it has always been trying to make sure that we give Africa a voice, because it's a place that have been denied, a voice on the global discourse because of years of prejudice, years of mistelling of the story of Africa. But I like bringing up the story, the world map of Herodotus here. You can clearly see Africa is very, very distorted there, just showing Libya, Ethiopia, and Egypt. And funny enough, the Nile River starts in the desert and comes back. That's how Herodotus saw the world. But perhaps here, Africa wins because the US misses out altogether. So, so yes, it's a reminder that we come a long way in terms of telling the story of the past. But sometimes some obvious errors that are easily explained, but there are some that are more intentional, and we may need that conscious return to retelling the story of Africa much better. To the right, you see the world map. This time is a projection of the famous Mercator projection, which until 2018 was still the dominant world map. What you're seeing in the darker shade there is the true scale, but the Mercator projection showed the one in the lighter scale there with, much of the US, and parts of Europe exaggerated in size, making Africa look smaller. Only in 2018, they were able to actually change that, which was very recent. Everybody knew the projection was not right, but it was kept because it served some purposes. The effect of that is that it's a lot of these smaller things that come together to make Africa look invisible. Like it doesn't exist, it's not there, it's not a contributor of history. Like Radu says, it's just an accident of geography. Otherwise, there's nothing to call Africa. It does not exist. So those are the things that keep me awake. I hope we all have other things that keep us awake. But please enjoy your sleep. So as I began to study, grew up in southeastern Zimbabwe, actually the arrow is pointing very close to my home area. Great Zimbabwe is about 100 miles northwest of my home area. And we grew up at a time when not much about Africa or Africanness was celebrated. Many of the colonial education we're receiving, even though I studied in the post-colonial period, the educational system still retained the colonial blueprint in which, Africans were thought to have not achieved much or anything worth recording or studying. As a sixth grader, I was fortunate. Actually, I pushed through for a field trip to go to Great Zimbabwe, which was introduced for the first time in our rural school by a new teacher who had moved to our school. And so this trip was supposed to be a trip for the seventh graders only. And I was in my fifth grade. The sixth graders were supposed to work the whole year to raise money to go when they are now in the seventh grade. So I joined them as they were working because I wanted to also go to Great Zimbabwe. And I was told that if someone drops out, I might get access. Otherwise, the trip is strictly for those that are in the seventh grade. And I was going to be in the sixth grade the next year. So I wasn't going to qualify. But I wanted to go very badly. So I said, well, if I don't get it, a chance, so be it. But maybe one or two, they may get sick and I might get an opportunity. And indeed, three of them, thanks to the powerful gods, they dropped out and I got a spot, which allowed me to go to Great Zimbabwe for the very first time. I think getting to that place then as a sixth grader, already I was small, but that place knows how to cut you to size, no matter how big you are. These massive walls that greets you, they just, you're just met with awesome greatness, grandeur of a big scale. That is really, really remarkable. And then when you begin to see and hear about the kind of things that were recovered from this site, I just fell in love with the site. And I didn't know that one could study archaeology until I went to university when I realized, oh, this is the study of the same place that I'm excited and interested about that helps us to tell the story of Africa as a place of achievement. So it was very exciting. And I realized that outside Africa and within Africa as well, many people are still not yet familiar with the other things that happened on our continent. Some do accept that we all come from Africa, a very deep history. The last 7 million years is the only continent with the fossil and genetic record of our human history until about 100,000 years ago when people began to migrate out of Africa and still came back for other connections and trade and so forth. But very few recognize that great things continue to happen after the out of Africa migrations. The implication is that once people moved out of Africa, things began to happen outside Africa, and back in Africa, very little happened. So most of my work is about trying to refocus to say, here is what continued to happen on the continent after the out of Africa migrations. That's basically, and the map here is just a gross underestimation of some of the big civilizations we see on the continent. It's highlighting, it's intentionally left out the names there so that maybe you can refresh your mind. Those of you that are familiar with one of it or two, clearly Egypt is easy to pick on the top right corner. Some may know or may not know about Nubia or Sudan to the south of Egypt. There are other parts that are not shown here on the map, like in Morocco. We know of the several civilizations, including the one that ended up ruling in Spain and Portugal for almost 100 years. The Islamic North Africans that were, ruling there as the Moors. But we know maybe of Mansa Musa to the in West Africa. That's the Mali Empire, so I try to highlight that. But well, if we say let's complete the puzzle, I'm not sure how many of us will be able to get all of these and get them right. And yet they are not the only ones. We have over 25 of these civilizations besides Egypt. So it's just a reminder that we still have a long way in terms of telling the story of Africa. There are many reasons. Research is one of that. Access to university, higher education, expertise, and several other things just amount to distract from the many examples of the past we have on the continent. I just tried to zoom here. Unfortunately, I apologize to those with the smaller screens. I had to put this, again, another gross estimation just to squish and squash and just to show in terms of time, because that's one of the things that seem to be a misreading on much of the story of Africa outside Africa, is that many people believe Egypt was a standalone civilization. It never interacted with other African civilizations. The rest of African civilizations, they are just 19th century representations, something that is a product of many museums, unfortunately, because the collection histories seem to reflect that. We have collectors going to collect deep past examples from Egypt, going back all the way 5,000 years ago. When it comes to Africa, they mostly collected art that represents the 19th and 20th century, giving the impression that there is a 5,000-year gap between Africa and the rest of Africa and Egypt. But we know that Nubia, for example, was always parallel with Egypt throughout much of its history. We have several other civilizations. We'll touch on a few here just to highlight and to show. Of course, we know that once we hit the 1000s, we meet the golden age of African civilizations, where we have got lots and lots of other things happening throughout. But perhaps just a small highlight on one of my favorite leaders from Nubia, Queen Kandake Amanrenas. So down in south of Egypt, we had the Nubian civilization, which was ruled towards the latter part of it mostly by women. Here's an example of one of them, known as Amanrenas. You may realize that they're all using so they ruled in succession for several years. Many of them, their name starts with Aman or Amun, the god Amun for Egypt. So they clearly are connected with Egypt, and they use the title Kandake, which is where we get the name Candice from. So if you know of any Candice, that name originally comes from Africa, from the Nubians. The Greeks couldn't say Kandake, and they ended up rewriting it as Candice, and it remains today, which is not the only example of some of the names coming from Africa. Suzanne is another one, obviously coming from Egypt and meaning flower. So we have lots of other things and connections with the continent. So Amanrenas reigned at a time when first it was a husband in power, and one of the powerful rulers of the world at the time was expanding and taking over Egypt, and it already, of course, taken over much of the Mediterranean world. This is the famous Augustus Caesar. So he reigns and he's expanding. He knows that there's gold down to the south in Nubia, and he takes over parts of Nubia. When the husband was ruling, the husband passes away, and she takes over, and she begins to kick Augustus and his armies back, push back, and fought for over 5 years. She fought back. She took most of the land that was lost. She did several of these raids where she was tearing down many of the statues, for them, including this example you are seeing here, which she took back to Nubia. she buried this specific one under her victory celebration structure that she built, and it was only recovered in the 1940s by archaeologists buried under one of the temples. And during that time, she was able to, after the 5 years, they had to come and negotiate, and they had a treaty. They retreated from Nubia, and they came back, only to trade and not to take any land. Just an example of some of the great things some of the less familiar African leaders are known and famous for. This is the example of the Nubians here. I don't want to overdwell on this. I'm just talking about the context within which we find the civilization of Great Zimbabwe. So we are taking one example in North Africa. Let's go to parts of West Africa. Again, some that may be less familiar. The Senegambian stone circles. These are the number close to 3,000 in the area between the rivers Gambia and Senegal River. So within that, we have lots and lots of these carved laterite rock, carved, tumuli and monuments and megalith that mark both oriented in terms of their response to the cosmological world. They do point, towards the direction of the moon and the path, and but they're all very, very difficult to have made. They would have required very tough iron tools to shape into this, this shape. And this brings us to one of the early, some of the parallel early developments that we see in terms of the invention of the iron metallurgy, which goes back to about 2000 BC in parts of West Africa and Central Africa, the oldest in the world, when other parts of the world were still using bronze and other softer metal. These Africans figured out how to innovate and work iron, which is very complex compared to other metals. It took about 5,000 years for Europe and Asia to transition from using copper to iron. But the Africans started doing this with iron and copper at the same time, just to show that they didn't need something the equal amount of time to practice. But these are interesting examples that number there are a lot in terms of their expression. Very, very difficult and tough to have made, and would have required complex specialization to make and manufacture, but it's just another expression of a different culture, of a different style. These stone circles are an architectural marvel in this part of the world. Back again to North Africa, we have the Garamandes, southern Libya. This is within the desert, about 600 miles into the desert. We may recall that the Sahara Desert, which is the world's largest hot desert, before it became desert, it was actually lush with vegetation, water, and animals. Sometime around 5,000 BC or so, it began to dry. In the process of drying, some of the lakes ended up being buried and trapped underneath as fossil water. So it looks desert from the top, but underneath there are lakes that are buried. So these Garamantians figured out that there is water hiding underneath. And if we can find ways of tapping into that water and draining it into the wadis, we can make life in the desert. And that they did. So they introduced these very exciting examples of, drainage system that we see, which is basically digging these wells that are separated with some access shafts, enough like manholes to drain water. The water was not drained from the surface. It went underneath because it's in the desert. Otherwise, most of it would evaporate. So they kept the water, underground and drained it to the wadis in the valleys where they were able to grow, and make life Some of the largest wadis, they numbered, close to 50,000 people in the wadis. And this was a complex innovation of its own, just to discover that there's fossil water that's hiding underneath them, and we can actually do something about it. It was not only that, they developed their own complex writing system, which unfortunately has not yet been deciphered, but it exists. They had complex military operations, and they understood the desert. Some of the trade routes that are being used, in the much later periods, goes back to the time of this, where these North Africans were actually figuring out how to cross the desert and which place to go and which route to use and what landmarks, you needed. So that was another style and type of civilization that we see. Again, on the Horn of Africa, slightly closer to Egypt, but different. This is now the area between Ethiopia and Eritrea. There was a civilization known as Aksum, which at the time was one of the only four civilizations that were making and minting gold coins. Just to show how complex, and advanced they were. They're the very first civilization to put the cross on the coins. No other civilization had started putting the cross because they were beginning to believe in Christianity and to be influenced by the ongoing Christianity. Something that they ended up slightly excelling in. You'll see many of the other examples there, but they're also famous for the world's longest or tallest stela, which unfortunately fell and broke down, but it's still living today as a testimony. No one has been able to construct another stela which is longer than that. They're also famous for making this other stela, the victory stela for King Ezana. It's known as the Ezana stone, which is written in 3 languages, Greek, Serbian, as well as Ge'ez, their own Ethiopian ancient language, which they invented and wrote and understood it enough to be able to translate it to other languages as well. So yes, there clearly were other civilizations that were advanced during this time and had complex writing, and also emphasizing on other things that we don't see in other places as well. Again, on the same footprint, much more within the Ethiopia side, we see now the emergence of the Ethiopian civilization itself, which takes over when Aksum collapses. And this is the time where we see intensification of some of the most unique examples of architecture in the world. This particular one is the example of the Lalibela churches, where King Lalibela, who at the time had visited Jerusalem, and because of the threats of Islam, felt that Christianity was under threat, because these guys, they had converted to Christianity, and they also believed that they traced back to the time when the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon, the biblical King Solomon, and came back with a child, Menelik, and who created this civilization to them. So they were trying to preserve Christianity, and they realized that Jerusalem was about to fall into the hands of, the Islamic forces. Therefore, they had to build a new Jerusalem. And so they moved this new Jerusalem into Ethiopia, and they went up high the hills and began to carve buildings out of stone. That's basically what they did. So this is not a built from the bottom up, it's carved from the top bottom. And they created, we know about at least 3 complexes that we see on the map there. All of them, they are connected with these underground tunnels that connects to them. So the main thing was protection. So if you are to, access this place, you have to access them through these sacred tunnels and entrances. Otherwise, you can't approach from the top, because, there's no access. They even carved a river on top, on top of the river Jordan, so that it can look like the real Jerusalem. That's how complex and advanced these people were. Everything is fully designed. before you start carving, because you can't make a mistake and come back and plaster. You have to make sure that everything is on point. And so all the doors, the windows, the entrances, the dimensions, everything have to be predetermined, and you have to do it to the best of your ability. So we see another complex innovation that was happening there. This is obviously the time when Great Zimbabwe is beginning to come into place as well. So these are some of the peers. We have already mentioned Mansa Musa, a king who ruled in the Empire of Mali, which reigned in the footprint of a previous civilization, ancient Ghana, which when Mansa Musa became very famous because Mansa was the title of a king. He took the famous trip to Mecca because he had converted to Islam. And because of that, if you are a Muslim who is worth his salt, you have to take that one trip to Mecca, which is known as the Hajj. So he did take that trip, and he did it in exciting fashion. With him, he took over 60,000 people, including another 12,000 or so of carrymen that were carrying gold, 800 camels with about 300 pounds of gold each, and several other things. It was a trip for 2 years. Each day or each Friday for those 2 years, wherever he was stopping and building a mosque on the way. So he's famous for really, really building some of the and expanding, Islam in North Africa and making it one of the standing testaments of the time. He is also famous for not being celebrated so much in Egypt, because he passed through Egypt and he was giving too many people gold, and the value of gold, unfortunately, is based on scarcity. So if too many people have it, it doesn't remain as valuable. So he crashed the market value of gold for about 10 years. It could not recover from one man's trip because he was not trading the gold, he was giving it away. And that put him on the world map, very literally, actually. He was, a few years later, he began to be drawn on the map, holding the gold in his hand. So they realized they had to make everyone know that there is a very wealthy man in Africa who is famous for owning the hills. He owned most of the gold, the whole civilization for Mali, just like ancient Ghana or the successor. The Songhai was based on the trade in two most important items: gold coming from the south, and from the north was the salt from the desert. So basically the exchange. So he controlled most of the gold mines down to the south. And during that time, about 2/3 of the world's gold was coming from West Africa, basically coming from one man. So that's how wealthy the man was. Some tried to calculate his wealth, the equivalent of what it would have been, and then they realized it's pointless trying to calculate, because you really can't put a number onto that. At some point, they were talking of 400 billion, maybe in 2020, in 2012, and then they realized, no. This is still a gross underestimation. He was just wealth, and you must just say that and keep quiet. But he's also famous for promoting education. There was a university in Timbuktu, which had started before his time, but during his time, he actually, on the journey back, he brought scholars from Arabia, and he built one of the standing mosques that is still there, and later was used, of course, as a lecture room. And he financed and supported the growth of education. Timbuktu, the University of Timbuktu, is worth mentioning because this is a university that flourished. In the 1300s, it had student enrollment of about 20,000 students, which is equivalent to my university UIC today. So it was not a small university, and they were really studying and writing several manuscripts, many of which of course, got lost through the atrocious activities that happened during the colonial period, but some survived and are being right now digitized, some through the efforts from the University of Cape Town. And, it's just a testament of what other parts of the world were doing. And this is happening at a time when, much of Europe is still in the Dark Ages. So it's not really like this was commonplace. It was not as commonplace, to have universal education at this time. Again, we are jumping to West Africa, Benin, the civilization in the modern country Nigeria. Before there was a country Nigeria, so there's a country now called Benin. That's not what we're talking about. There is a civilization called Benin, which is located in the modern country Nigeria. It's famous. The Portuguese that went and saw the site, the city before it was burnt down. They reported that it had street lighting at a time when there was none in Lisbon. It's famous for some of the large mud walls that unfortunately have was faced with British fire much later on and got lost. They are inscribed in the Guinness Book of World Records as one of the largest man-built, structures that we have. They stretch their combined length stretch longer than the Great Wall of China. So they definitely were big, but they are more famous for their casting in lost works technology, something that got the attention of many of the European travelers and traders that were coming. So they would cast in brass, mostly in brass. The brass was, of course, being bought and imported from Europe, but they already had existing casting technology in copper and bronze. Many of the objects that the kings would commission, they were displayed at the king's court. One of the palace building, which is exemplified in this brass box there, shows what that palace building would have looked like. Within those walls, there were thousands and thousands of these artifacts of, very fine cast objects in relief, in different styles and patterns. They also had ivory carving and wood carving of the highest quality. And of course, we now know today that many of these objects are all over the world because of an unfortunate event that happened in 1897 when the British went with a punitive force and, trying to punish the Benin for the loss of one of the British generals that had approached Benin City at a time when the king was in ritual seclusion. And he was told not to. He forced through the trip and he got killed. And the British took that as a pretext and they went with a heavily armed force of about 1,200, heavily armed British with artillery. But they came with them, of course, curators that knew about what was in the building, and they were selecting the best pieces, which was shipped. All the soldiers were being paid by the loot. That was shipped to Liverpool, from where it was auctioned and sold to many places and many museums, all over the world. But it's one of the remarkable stories of, civilization down in Nigeria. Just Nigeria alone, just to give you context, has got, at least about 8 civilizations that we can talk about in just one country alone. The population of that country is the largest in Africa, and it also has more languages than the whole of Europe. So we are talking about a place that is really significant. But we just picked one example here. Now to East Africa, on the East African coast, all the way from the Mozambican coast in Southern Africa to Ethiopia. That's like 1,500 miles of the coastline. That coastline is dotted with what are known as city-states, basically civilizations that based on commerce along the coast. There was an existing network of trade within Africa before the arrival of the Arabs and the Chinese that were trading on the coast, that was being led by the Swahili people, which are the local Bantu people. That became Islamized very early with the arrival of the Islamic and Arabic traders on the East African coast. And they began to innovate and build using coral, which is looks very deceiving, looks like modern day plaster or stone walls, but this is actually coral. So they did a lot of other innovations, like this particular one. You can see the coins that they were also minting during this time, and the many of amazing structures. The example there, the Husuni Kubwa, which is the capital for Sultan Al Hassan bin Suleiman, was one of the most beautifully built structures of its time, with the swimming pools and other things that you see over there. Just to highlight that there were lots of other things happening, on the continent of Africa. We're just talking about the context. Unfortunately, we have not said anything about Great Zimbabwe as yet. But a quick one. To the southwestern coast, we have another civilization on Ndongo Matamba, which is modern day Angola as well as Democratic Republic of Congo, where we see another woman known as Queen Nzinga. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo Matamba reigned at a time when the Portuguese were beginning to land on the coast looking for gold. They had just moved from West Africa and they were moving further down to Southern Africa following the coast. They encountered earlier on the Congo civilization. Then they moved further down. They saw the smaller civilization of Ndongo, which at the time was not as big, but it contained the one gifted girl known as Queen Zinga, which before she became queen, the brother was the one ruling. She was sterilized by the brother, her and her sister, because the brother feared she was going to rule, which she ended up doing anyway. After failing to deal with the Portuguese, the brother invited the sister to go and negotiate on her behalf with the Portuguese. She had already learned Portuguese, so she knew, and she was a very, very gifted diplomat. But she says, before I go there, I can't go and negotiate as a representative. I must go and negotiate as king. And the brother had no choice and to agree. So she goes to negotiate as a king. She gets there. They have not put a chair for her. They've just left a mat for her to sit. Everyone else sitting on the chairs. She says, well, I'm here as a king. I cannot sit on the mat. So one of the servants bends down and she sits on the servant as a chair during the negotiation. All of what that did is that it threw them off balance because they didn't know how to deal with her. She also had predetermined that they were very interested in converting, many people to Christianity. So she was prepared to do a fake baptism just to deceive them. So when they said, oh, can we baptize you? She said, oh, yes, let's go ahead. And they went and baptized. When she got home, she said, you saw what the white man did there? The white man was anointing me to be king. So I'm now king. So she comes back and she was really that tactical. And for over 40 years, she was not colonized and there was no slave hunting in Ndongo Matamba. And because of that, many places where there was slave hunting, they would run and come and seek refuge in her. She was that gifted. And she's really famous for, her stance on anti-slavery. Okay, let's come down to Southern Africa. We have spoken about the context. Now we are down in Southern Africa. How do we know if there's a civilization in Southern Africa? Many of the civilizations, or the greatest that we know, we don't know them from, from historical times. We know them from archaeological times. We know that, in modern times, you find there are different levels of social stratification. There's a village head, there's a ward head, some petty chiefs, some senior chiefs, even some paramount chiefs that more like equal to national in terms of the scale. But when we go to the archaeological record, we see an even bigger, and bigger level, which is more regional, where we see examples like, the emperor version or king. One starting with Mapungubwe, the border between South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. And then the biggest, the highest level, level 7, is the one for Great Zimbabwe. And so we're going to see how archaeologists ended up talking about this as a civilization. So starting with the rise of what is known as the Zimbabwe culture pattern. So before that, many of the Bantu people that arrived in Southern Africa around 200 AD, they were settling and keeping cattle in the center. So they used what is known as the central cattle pattern, where you build houses around your cattle byre so that the animals stay there protected, because animals were very important. But at this one place known as in the archaeological site of K2 or Bamandanalo, at this site, around 1220 AD or CE, they began to remove the cattle craw from the center. And that gets stratigraphically replaced by the ash median, where the people met to discuss important things like the court. So during that time, the cattle is no longer in the center because cattle is now assuming a new role, and there's a new pattern, which is known as the Zimbabwe culture pattern. In the Zimbabwe culture pattern, you have rulers that are staying either in the center of the site or on hilltops, and they build walls to express their new status. They live separated from the commoners, either by elevation as well as the stone walling. So that's the new Zimbabwe culture part. It starts happening there. But because this was in the valley, it was not easy to express this. So they moved to the neighboring site known as the Mapungubwe, which is where we have a much better place to express this. You can clearly see the commoners in the valley and the elites on the hilltop. So if you go on the hilltop there are several gold burials that were found there. The material culture you find in the valley is not the same as the one you see on the hilltop. So they're clearly beginning to express themselves slightly different. And there's no cattle craw that you see within the settlement here. This is the same pattern that you see at Great Zimbabwe, but it's beginning to make us think like, why are they doing this? Why are they investing in something that is very costly, like things that are just there, but they're not functional? They show strength, they show other things, but they go beyond just the material. So archaeologists call this costly signaling, where you invest a lot in things that are not necessarily functional. You are trying to, communicate a worldview that is beyond just the function. That's what we see in most of the Zimbabwe culture sites. These are some of the examples. So you find these big stone walls that also have decorations like this. That decoration has nothing to do with the stability of the walls. It's just there to communicate other messages that are coded in there. And we see a lot of this symbolic code that is repeated at many of the sites. The decorations on the stone walling here, you see the chevron, the herringbone, the dendele, all of this, you find these patterns. They have nothing to do with the integrity of the structure, but they're all about communicating these symbolic messages. So yes, this is where we end up at Great Zimbabwe with its styles of walling, and we'll show you some of those examples. But how big exactly are we talking about here in terms of the Zimbabwe culture? We are talking of a place, a civilization that stretched and covered much of Zimbabwe, the country. If you're familiar with the map in the center there, that's the map of Zimbabwe. But the sites are also found in parts of Mozambique, parts of northern South Africa, parts of Botswana, parts of Zambia. It's that widespread, it's that big, and Great Zimbabwe is somewhere closer to the center there. But of all of these, Great Zimbabwe is the biggest. But let's just show you some other examples of the Zimbabwe type sites that we are familiar with. This is the site of Kami in Western Zimbabwe. As you can see, this is terraced, so it's not like the enclosures like you see at Great Zimbabwe. This is the terracing on the hill. The whole hill is terraced with lots of these beautiful decorative checkered patterns that you see there, and some herringbone in some places. And the houses were built on top, and as well as in the valley, and on those terraces, they were also building houses and structures to stay. Here's another example from Botswana for the site of Majojo, as well as Kasekete in parts of northern Zimbabwe. Just showing a run through of some of the sites. Another site here in Zimbabwe, known as Naletale in central Zimbabwe. You can see again the lavish decorations and patterns, again, very, very beautiful. There is also the site of Dlodlo or Danamombe, again in central Zimbabwe, emphasizing again the decorations and the styles, the coursing, all of that is typical of the Zimbabwe type sites. Here's another site known as Regina in central Zimbabwe. Another site again in northern Zimbabwe, northwestern Zimbabwe, the site of Mutowa, Shangano, as well as Bumbuzi. Another site again in Western Zimbabwe, Lusingo. There's another site in Salansala with the decorations as well. Just zooming into a few examples, Shangangwe in central Zimbabwe, another site. But of all of them, Great Zimbabwe is the biggest, without doubt. It's the scale that was, expressed here it doesn't even come close to many of the other examples there. So we know that definitely this was a really, really, really huge and big capital. We are zooming here into the background that shows the Great Enclosure, which south of the pyramids is the largest structure that was built in pre-colonial times. So we know that this is certainly in terms of scale over there. That Great Enclosure itself alone was built with over 1 million blocks. And these are bricks that are built without any binding mortar, just using the precise placement method of brick upon brick or rock upon rock. That is able to stand and withstand the shock waves of gunfire and other things. And because it's built without any binding mortar, it can adjust and find new balance. It doesn't collapse. Something that some of the early conservators did not understand. This is an example of the hill complex, which is where the stone walling starts. So this is the eastern enclosure pointed in the arrow there, the western enclosure in the background, as you can see over them. We'll show you another zoom into the western enclosure, which shows some of the conservation mistakes that happened. But this is the other view. This is the terraced side of the hill. On top there, you can see the western enclosure on top of the hill. But there are several other stone walls on the terraces that are there. We excavated one of those terraces some 2 years ago, and we underestimated. We thought this was just a simple wall that's protruding out. We ended up quitting at 4 meters. So some of those walls there, they go as deep as 4 meters in terms of their bearing sections and sections of walling. So the massive investment that went into terracing some of those walls is not to be underestimated at all. Yeah, you can see here a zoom into the hill complex on the western enclosure. The big gap you are seeing to the left there is not a natural collapse. It's what the conservators created. Some of the early public works department that was managing the site, when they saw some of the bulges on the walls, they thought the wall was collapsing. So they wanted to relieve pressure by removing and digging away the archaeological deposit on the inside. So they dug away, over 2 meters of deposit. All that red stuff you are seeing there is the areas that they exposed. In the process, they created a highway, and the water washed away the walls, and they just did not understand what they were doing. But that's just part of the hill complex. Again, back to the Great Enclosure, which this is a view from above, an architectural marvel of its own. On top of the walls, you can actually drive your car on top if you can. That's how wide the walls are on top. They're much wider at the base. They rise to about 32, 35 feet. The tallest part, and it's as wide as 11 meters at the base. All of this built without any binding mortar. They are paved on the parallel passage that you are seeing to the left, with the drainages for taking the water outside, the enclosures, and a real architectural marvel. This is a zoom into the parallel passage inside the Great Enclosure, just to show you what that looks like. This is another view again of the parallel passage. You can clearly see that the blocks and the coursing, they're all maintaining coursing throughout, and this goes all the way to the top. There's another view from the inside. You can see the chord decoration pattern with those dark type of rocks that are making those zebra lines to the left. And that's the conical tower on the inside, which survived several digs. People thinking that there was a huge pot of gold hiding underneath. They tried to hack, and thanks to the efforts of the conservators, it is still standing today. These are some of the drainages that take away some of the excess water from within the wall. So they really knew what they were doing. And some of the entrances, this is the view from outside. And you can see some of the monoliths on top and the decorations high up, on the walls, just on the great enclosure alone. We also have the valley enclosures, which is where we see, again, the continuation of the same pattern, but slightly at a reduced scale compared to the greater enclosure. These are some of the views of the walls from there. There also was life outside the walls. We see some of these mud walls that you're seeing there. These are houses and courtyards that were built of clay. We call this the Zimbabwe cement. The clay is very resistant. This actually is one of the car parks where at the site. So we realized that because of the long history of the site, people were neglecting to preserve the site, and they were actually coming and building, on top of the site. So we exposed some of those walls. This the excavation to the left shows some of the maps of what the plan of those houses looked like. The famous object to be found includes this zoomorphic, pottery, which is thought to have been the talking one. So they say this particular pot used to talk and walk around and communicate messages. And it was actually not discovered at Great Zimbabwe South because it had gone about delivering the message. But back to the distractions that makes it difficult to reconstruct the story of Great Zimbabwe. We already told you about how the public works threw away several meters of deposit. But that's not the only challenge. The other challenge is that there were many years of treasure hunting that took artifacts from Great Zimbabwe before archaeologists were able to get there. The famous objects, the soapstone beds, these are soapstone carved, as well as the boils and several other items, are some of the ones that have got some of the most exciting histories in terms of their travels. So you find most of the objects today still retained in Zimbabwe, but there are some that are in Cape Town. There are some that are, in other parts of the world, including outside the continent. Maybe we can talk about one example here, which is the soapstone bed you're seeing to the left there was cut off from its beam and taken and sold or given to the colonizer of Great Zimbabwe, Cecil John Rhodes, who had a house built, in Cape Town. As you can see on the house, if you zoom into the image to the right, you see some of the soapstone beds that there was just inspiration from some of these beds from Great Zimbabwe. Within that house, which has now been turned into a site museum, it's within the presidential compound, so you can go there anytime. He still has one of those beds, in there, which recently we made some efforts to go and ask for permission to make a reproduction of some of that particular bed. So we have it. You see the image to the right there. That black shed there is for that particular image that we made a reproduction of. We also made a reproduction of one of the most exciting pieces, like this one you are seeing on the center there. That's a piece of the Zimbabwe bed, which was actually discovered in two pieces. The lower half of it, if you close to the neck there, you can see a dividing line. That was a break. So the first item to be discovered was the bottom, which was taken and removed, and nobody knows when. But in 1907, it was bought by the museum in Berlin. And during the Second World War, it was taken to Russia. After the Second World War, it was returned to Germany, where it belonged to the Prussian, Cultural Heritage Foundation, which actually still retains title to today for that particular part, even though they returned it to Zimbabwe in 2000. They refused to return title. They gave it as a permanent loan, and it was reunited, and it's now, together as one piece. It just shows some of these complex innovations. But we're doing this because we're in the process of redoing our Egypt and Africa Hall at the Field Museum, and so we wanted, to have these beds highlighted in that particular exhibit. So come 2018, please come see us at the Field Museum. More items of imports that we know from Great Zimbabwe includes this jade teapot, several Chinese objects, including material that represents all at least three Chinese dynasties, the Ming dynasty, the Yang dynasty, as well as the Song dynasty. All of their material you find that at Great Zimbabwe. There are several imports that were found, at Great Zimbabwe, including glass beads from all over the world, that tell a testimony or story of the travel. The image, the zebra style of the bead you are seeing to the left there is some of the examples of glass beads that are famous or known from Egypt. So we know that there was also some intercontinental connections. The Portuguese tried to locate the site, perhaps without too much success, but they ended up trading some of the fake objects, like this particular one here, an imitation of the conch shell that they made in ceramic and painted white, and they tried to fool people, but nobody was fooled. Yeah, but we know the metallurgy from the site is expressive and interesting, including the brass technology, that brass working crucible, copper, iron, gold. All of this was found and recovered at Great Zimbabwe, and some of it was actually manufactured within the site itself. Gold being one of the things that attracted many people to the site. We don't know how much gold was taken at Great Zimbabwe. Very few was reported. Some of that you see on the image there, that's what survives, but we know that there was a lot more other gold. The little gold molds, crucibles you are seeing to the top right there, are one of the over 60 that we recovered from our excavations in 2014 at Great Zimbabwe. Just with the traces of gold on the inside, they were casting buttons of gold into those crucibles. So we know that there was lots of gold that was recovered at the site. Again, regional connections within the region, they connected with the coast. The example that we spoke about here of Kilwa Kisuwani, the ruler there, Al Hassan bin Suleiman, one of his coins was also found at Great Zimbabwe, including some of these double bell gongs that we know are famous from Central and West Africa. They were also found at Great Zimbabwe. So it was already connected regionally and was connected internationally and was also connected locally. And it was a testament of a site. I'm sure by now I must have managed to bore a few people to sleep. I was trying to make sure that I break the record and
No, you didn't
all
put
of
me
you
to
to sleep.
sleep. That was excellent.
Yeah.
I've got lots of questions. So first of all, on the Great Enclosure, where did they get all the rock from? Was there a nearby quarry? And how long did it take to build that? Is there any idea on?
Yeah, so there's some useful early work that can help in terms of retailing, but in terms of the quarrying, so most of the rock is locally quarried, but there are quarry sites within the site where they're doing this, which is another innovation because they're basically heating rock and cooling it with water to crack large pieces of of granite, and then going to reshape it and into blocks or brick-like blocks, which if you look very closely, you don't actually see traces of hammering. So you don't know how they were making these bricks because they clearly were doing some interesting things there because you don't see these several lines of trying to hammer and reshape, and it just looks like clean blocks for the most part. The construction of the site of the great enclosure itself should have taken at least close to 100 years. They would have started in the center on the inside and built it outside backwards. That's the proposition that is there, because if you build backwards, you don't need to put a ladder. You use the same walls to go up, and then you come down towards the end to finish. And there are estimates of at least over 1 million blocks that were required to make that. So the labor investment that is required to make just the great enclosure alone, of which we have got another structure that is equal in size, if not more, on the hill complex itself, and several others on the valley, and several others, on the smaller hills around it. In In 2014, we did some surveys after a fire had burned out. We saw other walls that are unknown for a long time. It shows that there was just so much labor investment that went into building this, and we don't know how they financed it. It's amazing.
I don't want to jump in front of everybody else, but I got more questions. The tunnels in Ethiopia where it connected the three communities, are those tunnels that went under the river, are they still there? I
Oh,
mean,
yes.
they're still, you can still go from one to the other to the other?
So the exciting thing about the Ethiopian Lalibela churches is that they're still living, and they are churches they're still functioning churches. So you can visit as a tourist and access and go and see the places, but they're still there. They're
Wow.
still standing, and they're carved mostly from sandstone. Parts of the areas could be showing years, age, and other things, but they're mostly still intact, and they're still there and standing.
That's amazing. Well, I'll let other people ask some more questions. No?
I have one. I'm interested in are there, you talked about the different artifacts that are in museums around the world. Are there lots of repatriation efforts to return those things, or is that not a large issue, really?
It's case by case. I think the biggest is Benin, that
Yeah,
has been in the headlines for the longest time, partly because it was a very clear case of how they were taken, clearly documented, and easier to trace.
sure.
There are other objects that are not as easy to trace, including human remains and other things that are still found in several museums. Parts of the histories that very few museums are proud of today, but it's still part of the history.
Right.
Benin, I think, has taken most of the headlines in terms of the stories of return. And recently, there was some momentum building around that because of the other efforts that were coming within Nigeria itself, as well as other international groups. There is a group known as Digital Benin, which is literally documenting places and examples where these objects are found throughout the world. And within Nigeria, the government is making those conscious efforts. The Benin, the civilization is still there. There is a new king, the Oba there, and the others that actually have been returning some of the items directly to the king. So there are different case by case examples of all of this. I don't think there will be a time when there will be enough returned. I think there will always be a need to continue doing this conscious effort. I was in Cameroon myself last December, where we went to see one of the kings of the Banjun people, and we were talking about some of the collection items and how they ended up in the different museums. And the king himself quickly stopped me, and he said, "Hey, we must not assume always that many of these objects were stolen. There were some things that I saw my own father giving to some of the travelers as they were coming and visiting our palace. My own father gave a lot of objects to these travelers, and he did not even consult the others, he just gave them. So some objects are there not because they were stolen. So those may be difficult to prove, but there are some that are much more obvious and difficult to deny that this is a case of, unjust, stealing. So it will be a case by case basis. We do have also other interesting examples of the community, like the one we're working with at the Field Museum, the Bamun people of Cameroon, who they say the number up to about 400,000 people in the US and Canada. And they realize that many of their children and grandchildren in North America may never go to Cameroon. So if they find a museum that is willing to exhibit their culture here, they're happy to work with us so that their people can learn and see their culture much closer here than they can in terms of
Sure.
waiting to go to Cameroon for a lifetime. So that will be a case by case basis for examples of return. And then the examples of we want to give you more so that you can tell our story.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
So I have a question on the obviously there was a lot of metal work done before, but you said, when the Great Migration out of Africa, the ability to work iron, what did not happen, did not go with them when they migrated out to other countries. So it took them longer in Europe and all that to develop the same things that were still ongoing. So what's the theory about why working iron did not migrate when people migrated out of Africa?
Oh yeah, so let's go backwards and get this straight. So the early migrations out of Africa, they are much older than the beginning of metallurgy.
Okay.
The very earliest is around 2 million years ago when we begin to see, an ancestor known as Homo erectus migrating out of Africa. That is not a true human. So
Right.
the true humans evolved around 300,000 years ago, again in Africa. And then they migrated around 100,000 years ago. That's when they began to move out of Africa. During that time, they had not started making metals. So that's not the time of the metal technology making. Metal was then discovered much later. So in parts of Egypt and parts of Europe and Asia, metallurgy dates back to around 900 to 11,000 years ago.
Right.
So that's much later on. And that's one of the earliest metallurgical examples we have in the world. But that's mostly copper. So that's simple metal. So they stayed in the copper age. So Europe and Egypt have a copper age. The rest of Africa did not join the copper age. They did not work copper during that time. From copper, they began to transition into bronze. So bronze is a mix of copper and tin. Bronze is harder than copper in terms of utilitarian tools. So if you are making a spear, a knife, a hoe, you would rather use bronze than use copper because copper is too soft. Just like gold is also very soft. That time when they began to make bronze in Europe is known as the Bronze Age. It was only around 1000, BCE, which is around, 3000 years ago when they began to work iron. Africans, independently of what's happening in Europe, invented their own iron and copper technology around 2000 BC. So that makes that iron technology the oldest in the world. It's older than the one you have, in Europe and Asia. So that's basically what I was mentioning. So for Africans, as you can see, they did not need to transition from copper age to bronze age before they can reach iron age. They start with the iron age without having to transition. So the time when iron is mostly in use, people will usually call that time the iron age, the time when iron is mostly in use. For much of sub-Saharan Africa, they start with the iron age, straight from the Stone Age to the Iron Age without having to go through that apprenticeship phase of copper, bronze, and then iron.
Okay. I guess I wasn't
But
phrasing
in
my
terms of
question correctly,
in terms of
but
the
you
theories,
had,
maybe I can touch on the theories in terms of you were trying to say how do we explain how they did it? Because that has been a very heated debate about because iron is very, very complex to smelt. It's not easy. The range of conditions that you need to maintain for a certain period before you can actually produce metal is very narrow. And for people that don't have any recipe written down, they don't have any writing technology, they don't have any laboratories or other things, it's difficult to explain, for many people. But of course, there are other pyrotechnologies or heat-related or heat-mediated transformations that were happening. The firing of ceramics and pottery is another example. It's not the same temperatures, but of course one can also learn and innovate. And more importantly, we see lots and lots and lots of innovations. Once they begin to start making iron and copper, they innovated more than we see outside Africa. So it shows that these are people that are very experimental in nature. We have some cultures that were smelting very low iron ore grade, like about 40%, something that even by modern standards, you cannot smelt that. It's not economical at all. But they were doing it because they devised furnaces that responded to that particular kind of ores. There are also other civilizations that were smelting other ores that are contaminated with titanium, arsenic, and other things that, many modern, examples would not be able to smell that kind of ore because it mixes and then becomes brittle. But they were devising a different kind of technology that only smelted the impurities and not the iron. So the modern technology smelt everything melts. Iron, because it's heavier, it goes to the bottom, and then the dirt goes on top and is skimmed off. But in the broomery technology, you only melt the impurities. The impurities include silica and alumina and others. Their melting point is actually higher than that of iron. But under certain conditions, you can flux it or bring it lower than that of iron. So it's getting to those conditions that make you able to lower the melting point of the impurities and then melt them away and then retain the metal. That's really complex stuff. That's complex science. Yeah.
Thank you. It's fascinating. I mean, absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
One question I might have is these various locations had a lot of people. In order to keep an organization and like that, a likes of that, they had to have a good language to control, to be able to communicate and that sort of thing. Do you have any kind of a feeling of a recording of various languages as these times developed and various areas developed and came to a head and went away? It seemed like you didn't hit languages, but it's an interesting aspect.
Oh, yes. Yeah, because languages is not my specialization. It's really elusive. But we do have reconstructed. So the people of Great Zimbabwe are linked to the Shona group or Shona speaking group, which is one of the languages that actually traces to the early Iron Age in Southern Africa, which is the arrival of the Bantu speaking people from Cameroon, the area around Cameroon going down. So the Bantu speakers are united by their common reference to the people using the Ntu or Bantu, Muntu, Abantu is just a reference to the people. And for a very, very big area, they're one of the biggest groups actually that covers much of parts of West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. These are the people that speak this related language. Their first arrival in Southern Africa is around 200 AD. And this has been linked and tied to other examples, including the arrival of metallurgy. So metals also arrive around the same time because these are the people that are bringing in that technology of working metal. They're also beginning to, live in settled life. Before that, the Stone Age hunter-gatherers and herders were very mobile. They were not really staying in one area for too long. But because these are farmers, you need 2 or 3 farming seasons before you can move. They settled in one area. So we see new patterns of sites that confirm that these are really new people that are here, and a lot of other, and they also make ceramics or pottery that are decorated in styles that we can clearly link and trace. So archaeologists have been using some of those ceramics the metallurgy as well as the language to trace the movements all the way from West Africa to Southern Africa. So we know that language was certainly central and important. One of our collaborators on a project we're working on in Zambia right now is a linguist at Georgetown University who is trying to reconstruct when some of these languages, when some of the terms begin to change. So that's a complex training and set of skill that I myself am not very privy to, but we know of the connection between some of the languages and some of the material culture, most likely, especially the ceramics that have been traced through some specific language groupings.
How many languages roughly are distributed throughout Africa?
Oh,
Yeah, how many languages in Africa? We have been losing languages in Africa because of course, conduct and other things that are happening, but at least over 2,000 have been recorded and documented. Nigeria alone has got over 600 of those. So then there's certainly many languages that are there. Zimbabwe boasts itself as the only country with the largest official languages in the world. So including sign language, and so yeah, but many of the languages that are on the continent have not been fully studied, which is something that is really not good, because we're fast losing some of those languages because of migration and contact, and they may never be really fully studied before they go extinct.
I'm curious about the stone circles. Is there any theory on if, or any evidence of what the purpose of the stone circles are? I mean, we've all heard about Stonehenge, but is it similar? The purpose or why they were doing stone circles?
Yeah, that's the challenge with the dealing with the African past without written records, is that you never really get the full story until someone invests enough time to decode some of these complex codes, because it's basically a coding system. One thing clearly is the arrangement of these stone circles and their direction. And of course, we know that there are also burials that go with that are associated with these stone circles as well. So there clearly is something that they are trying to communicate there. Whether it's what the full message is exactly is something that we still have to wait for new research to fully decode and tell us what exactly they're trying to communicate. Some of them, they are shaped in some letters that look like an A, some looks like an H, some is just a vertical pillar, some is a vertical pillar with a smoothening on top. There are different styles and types, and it's just amazing that there's a lot. We are just beginning to scratch the surface. Even in Great Zimbabwe, where we have close to 500 years of the study of the site, we still have not done enough to understand fully the whole site.
Yeah. Somebody asked a question in chat, and that was about the bird. Hold on, let me see if I get to it. Is the Zimbabwe bird thought to be based on an actual bird species?
Yeah, there are theories about at least two types of eagles, the fish eagle or the batalia. But the thing about those birds is that they are not actually normal birds. They are birds that also have human features. So they don't have, some of them, they do not have the beak, they have the human lips. Some of them, they do not have, they have human hands instead of, so they're mixing human features as well as, bird features. So that makes it very difficult to fully identify the species. Yeah, and and they're all not in the flying posture. Their wings are always down. So you can't even use that as well to try and decipher. So, but they all come standing on these very tall pillars, almost close to 2 meters, 1.5, 1.6 meters around there. And others have begun to speculate that maybe that they may be representing the secretary bird with his very tall legs. So maybe that's what they're trying to depict them like that. But yeah, we may not be really able to fully tell, but they've linked, the fish eagle mostly to what is happening there. The significance of those birds, though, is something that is slightly common in much of Africa, because basically the mixing of the human and bird features is trying to tell the people that we are messengers. We mediate between, the heavens. So when the birds fly to the heavens, they take the people's prayers, and when they come back and land, they are bringing the answers. So the leaders are the mediators between the living and the spirit world. One of the birds, the famous one, the Zimbabwe bird number 1, is also carved on the pillar. There is a crocodile, an alligator that is crawling towards the bird. And again, the significance of the crocodile is exactly the same as the bird, because it crosses the world. It lives in the underworld, in the water, comes out to hunt once in a while and goes back into the water. So that ability to cross the world, it means I can mediate between you and the dead as well. So if you have got challenges and issues, you come to us as the leaders, and we can speak on your behalf.
I'm still going back to that great enclosure, and the whole thing was made with no mortar.
Yes, not just that, all of the Zimbabwe type sites, all of them, there's not one that is made with binding mortar. They're all based on
That's
that.
amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, the skill set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And nobody knows quite how they did it.
No.
Or, I mean, you were saying the bricks, they
Oh, yes. So I was talking about how they were breaking the bricks and shaping them into the brick form. Because you don't really see traces. Usually when people are using hammer and chisel and other things to do this, you may see traces of, the chisel marks and other things. But in most of these blocks, they don't show most of those. So whatever instrument they're using to break it, they're doing it very carefully so that it doesn't leave these scratches and traces of, and they're doing it so nicely. But in terms of the construction, we know the technology of how they do it, because it's an ongoing tradition that there are living cultures today that are still doing the same. It's basically putting an outside face and then putting the rubble in the center, but you put it, each brick is placed, intentionally where it's supposed to go, according to its size, according to its direction and shape, so that, you maintain the coursing. So you can clearly see the coursing, that they are following one coursing. On the hill complex where the stone walling started, you can clearly see some of the portions. They actually don't have the same level of coursing being maintained. So in the early years, they're still learning the technique. They're not maintaining the coursing. But towards the top of the same building, you begin to see that this is now improved. They are now maintaining the coursing, and they don't have straight joints anymore. They are overlapping. So you can see the history of how the stone walling evolved, the construction technique, and how they learned this. But on the great enclosure, you can clearly see that they started with the quality style of building. So they already knew the technique when they started the great enclosure. They built it and maintained the coursing, as well as they were avoiding the straight joints.
I'm going to stop the video. We usually stop after some questions, but we can keep going. if I can find the thing. But by the way, in the chat, there are many messages of people saying thank you for the presentation and how much they enjoyed it. One person said had no idea, and I have to echo that. I was, I guess, very ignorant of, like you said, I knew Egypt and I knew the Nubian culture, but I knew very little of the rest of it. So this was quite fascinating. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I got so many questions, but I'm